My name's Alex George. I'm the owner of Skylark. I'm really, really thrilled to be here this evening and to welcome Meghan Gilliss remotely to join us to talk about her extraordinary book, Lungfish. Meghan attended the Bennington writing seminars and is a fellow of the Hugh Notes Artist Colony. She has worked as a journalist, a bookseller, a librarian, and a hospital worker, and she lives, lucky woman, in Portland, Maine. I say that I've just come back from a vacation there, and we love it, and we ate fabulously well and enjoyed all of the delights that are there. Lungfish is her first novel, and for those of you who have lived in Colombia long enough, when I say she was a bookseller, Meghan actually owned Get Lost Books, which is where our friends Yellow Dog Bookshop now are. So she knows Colombia well. So Meghan, welcome back, kind of.
Yeah.
Virtual sense. It's great to see you, and I'm so thrilled that you're able to come and talk with us about your wonderful book. So without further ado, perhaps you could read a little bit for us so we can get a flavor of this novel.
I will do that. Yeah. First, just hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, Alex, for having me here. It's very special to be back in Colombia in this way. It's been a minute, but this is lovely. So I think I'm just going to read a few very short chapters from up near the front of this book. And all you really need to know is that our narrator, Tuck, has recently, at the suggestion of her husband, who had become quite absent after the birth of their daughter, moved her family, that includes herself, her husband, and their young daughter, Agnes, who's 2.5, moved her family to a remote island house that had belonged to her grandmother, who has just died right before this story begins. So she's beginning to think that this move may not have solved their problems that they were having where they were previously living in Pittsburgh. Familiar. I smelled my grandmother on the blanket in the mornings after the night's worth of body heat made a sort of steam collect in the wool. I smelled her on my skin. I smelled my father too, when the tide was out and the mud squelched between our toes, offering up what the gulls circled for above, limp crabs and loose mollusks, baking alongside everything else too small to see, bodies already crushed and pulled apart into indiscernible bits. I smelled my brother in the smooth-barked oak on the high ground above the marsh, where what I'd identified from the field guides as trillium grew that time of year. As kids, we'd always come later, by which time the ferns had grown in and filled the dip, their glut of green fronds choking out what I now saw was the rest, the trillium, the fungus-laddered hunks of fallen trees. I smelled him on my hands. Agnes didn't like being left on the ground alone. Relax, Apple, I said. I'm coming. She screamed until I actually did. I didn't smell my mother. Agnes, I remind myself. Agnes, Agnes, Agnes. We're in the real world with Paul. The sun hit a place, the sky took on a certain hue, and there I was again, waiting. Familiar. Something smelled of foreign dirt, of musk and sour damp, of things I did not understand. In Pittsburgh, I thought it was the apartment, something left behind by the previous tenant, like the greasy stain on the wall above the bed, like the stack of VHS pornos atop the high kitchen cabinet. Here, against everything familiar, I knew it must have followed us and could almost name it. The dampness held by the house kept it intact almost long enough, seemed to cup it, hold it out for me. I waited until he was gone, ashore, then looked in every place again. I could almost name it, and then gone. Paul came home, beaten down, eager not to talk. Familiar. It takes time, Tuck, he said. What is it you want? Everything at once? I wanted groceries mostly, milk, fruit, oatmeal. I would have enjoyed one of those frozen pizzas loaded up with fake meat, dark little nuggets like rabbit pellets, but delicious. The kind of pizza he brought home and watched me put away when I was pregnant. The kind he brought home until he didn't, when maybe the sight of this hunger began to scare him. The kind I became embarrassed to ask for once Agnes was no longer inside my body, when my hunger was only mine. Tiger. He still wasn't home and our hunger had us agitated, fighting each other. Paul had said he'd stop at the supermarket. The sun was about to hit its place in the sky. I took Agnes into the uniform dimness of the house to avoid it. I looked for something to read to her. The book I pulled was cloth-bound and dark, like most of them. As I turned it over, the light from the window caught the embossed letters of the spine in a coppery flash. William Blake. Its bottom edges pressed into the flesh above my knees. Agnes coiled into my lap, behind it, sick of fighting me. And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart, and when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp, dare its deadly terrors clasp? And that was it. I knew it was. The musk, the smell I'd been tracking. Tiger. Agnes's head was on the pillow she'd dragged to the yard. I'd lain with her, per her orders, faking patience until she was sleeping. I again pulled the shirts out of his drawer, shook loose the blankets in the cedar chest, crouched to look under his side of the bed, lifted up the mattress, opened the drawers of my grandmother's writing desk, flapped open every cupboard, shined my flashlight into the damp crawl space, as if a tiger could fit into any of these tiny layers. But it was so close. It was with me, this musk that had followed us here. I prowled the house. In pencil, scrawled atop the wooden surface of her desk, bread, 8 o'clock. Did everyone's life revolve around food? Was I making too much of it? When Agnes woke up, I tried to let myself be pulled back toward her, to leave behind whatever it was I'd become. I billowed one of his loose shirts down over her head like a net, refolded it on the bed once she broke free, plucked up another from the floor while she carried the first to his drawer and laid it flat with a care that startled me. I'll stop there.
Oh, that was wonderful. That was a wonderful, it was great to sort of hear all those bits again and just go, oh yes, I remember that. That was lovely.
That's how you feel reading it as well. Oh yes, that part. I do remember
that. So I mean, I've sort of broken my questions down into various sort of bits, and I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about form, I guess. Now Tuck, your narrator, says in the very first chapter of the book, what's new now is everything I didn't see, which I sort of loved as a line. And we as readers, it feels as if we're discovering things along with her, because she seems, in this new place rather discombobulated, and she doesn't appear to be quite sure what's going on. And so we sort of, little by little, things are revealed to us. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that you've structured the book, and how and why you decided to write it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big question, and
start with the
answered in a lot of different ways. But I think sort of the most sort of important thing to know, not important, whatever, maybe the most interesting thing to know is that it was, I feel like in this book, our narrator Tuck is very much sort of grappling with what she's given. Like she's sort of latching on to her material world and just trying to use that to sort of get some foothold or make some sense of things. And that's very much the way the book was written as well. I didn't have a sense of where I was going. I was very much just working my way through a problem, and sort of handed my problem to this fictional character to sort of see what she would do with it, and also to be sort of an archivist of it along the way. So very much sort of written as sort of a grapple in the dark, latching onto things, which made it very difficult to pull together in the end, because I wasn't always very aware of like timelines or when certain plants, for instance, would be like flowering or or ripening or what have you. So there was a lot to sort of resolve, in revision, that was very, very difficult. And I think I wouldn't write another book so blindly again. I might not be that foolish, but I do think it sort of, that approach gave the book some of its, its heart, and it's what people have kindly called its propulsion, because I think there's
energy would have been a word that I would have used, and that sense of discovery as you go, which is I think a really crucial element to the whole thing. It reminds me of Michael Ondaatje said that when he started writing The English Patient, all he knew was that there was a soldier on a bed completely covered in bandages, and he didn't know anything else, and he just started and waited to see what would happen, which is a really, that kind of, it requires a certain degree, a certain spirit of adventure, I think, to be a writer who proceeds on that basis, rather than knowing, like, as opposed to John Irving, who writes the final line of the book first and works towards it. So I applaud you for that. But I really do think that it does give it a sense of propulsion and energy, and which is wonderful. A lot of the way that the book is written is in this sort of rather sort of fragmentary style. There are sort of single lines or single paragraphs, which reminded me a little bit of Jenny Offal and her work. But there would seem to be an important difference, because with Jenny's work, she seems rather confined by those sorts of clipped paragraphs. But in contrast to that, it seemed to have the opposite effect for you. And I sort of found there was a great deal of sort of liberation almost in that compressed form for you. And many of the book's reviewers have talked about the poetry of the book, and a lot of it is poetry, just or poetry adjacent at least. And I just want to note for the record that I think this is an excellent thing. But my question is, when you were doing that, so which came first? Did you deliberately go for that fragmented style because it allowed you that sort of a different kind of expression, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, it was really a sort of a happy marriage. I think I had come to really appreciate that style as a reader. Jenny Offal definitely was a big influence. I love her writing. It's so smart, and it gives you a little something to take away out of each paragraph. Mm-hmm. I love her to death. I do feel like sometimes it, the sort of heart of it can be a little bit hard to feel. It's a little, it kind of lives in your head, a bit. And I think a writer who came way before and who really like brought together the head and the heart was Mary Robeson with her book, Why Did I Ever? Which I actually picked up on a visit back to Columbia after selling Get Lost. And I think after Amy had sold it and it became Yellow Dog, I just walked in and nobody knew who I was. And I found a copy of that book, which I'd never heard of. And it was signed by Mary. And I had begun writing at the time, very bad short stories. I think I had just been accepted into an MFA program, and really didn't know what I was doing. But I read that book and it was just like, oh my God, like this is what lights me up. This is what I want to do. And it very much worked with my brain as well, which sort of had become, and I've talked about this before, so I apologize for anybody who has to hear me talk about my weak brain all the time, but having had Lyme disease at the time when I was living in Colombia that went undiagnosed for a long time, my brain just became like this like lump of useless gray matter that I really felt like I was dragging along with me. So when I read that book, it was really like I could feel the electricity in my brain, and it, I could feel like synapses firing, just because there were these little amazing sentences that had so much. They were so smart, but full of so much heart, and they talked to each other across the pages, which I think is what I loved most. It wasn't like something was said and then dropped, but it was said and then brought back up, and then that pulled you through to, across chapters. And just, it was almost like that book itself is a brain with little bits like communicating across time and space. And I think I did sort of start thinking about books as brains at that point. And then that helped me think about like creating a new brain for myself, since I felt like this one wasn't what I wanted it to be. And then, for better or for worse, I feel like this novel was my attempt to like rebuild a brain for myself, or sort of transfer my.
I love that idea of a book as a brain, and but the interconnectedness of it and the way that the pages talk to each other. That's perfect. That's so interesting. And for those of you watching who've read the book, that will make complete sense to you, because it certainly does to me. So that's really interesting. So you mentioned Tuck and Paul and Agnes, this family, and this is really at the core of the book, is about this family, which not an especially happy one for sure, but and it seems the family spends most of the book sort of teetering on the edge of coming apart at the seams. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about in particular is parenthood, and the way that you portray it in the book, and you do it with such a vividness and accuracy. And it sort of you've managed to depict both the agonies and the ecstasies of being a parent of a young child. Marcy Domansky in the Times suggested that the book was part of a new trend of survival parenting, which sort of made me laugh. I mean, I've got two children who are both grown now, and I think to a degree all parenting is survival parenting. But with this book, I mean, it's literally true. I mean, Tuck is going around, and there is this, looking for food to feed her child, and it's the anguish that I felt as a father, as a reader, reading these trials was very intense. And Tuck says at one point, so maybe I should just buy her a popsicle instead of keeping her alive. And you really do get the sense that the stakes here are very, very high. But it's also kind of like a two-way street, because there are times when I felt that it was Agnes who was keeping her mother alive and giving her the reason to keep going. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between Tuck and Agnes, and where you sort of conceived of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably I started writing a mother and child story because I was a parent for the first time, and that was my world. It was the most obvious thing for me to latch onto, and it was so, as you say, it's so complex. It's so it's so hard, and I wanted to capture that in the book, and I wanted to really, obviously the stakes are sort of high in this novel, so that sort of ratcheted up. But it was really important to me to also bring in the joy that is gotten from it, from the places you least expect it, or in the moments that you least expect it. So I do think I took issue with that review a little bit. I think the headline was something like, for squatters on a Maine island, life is only survival, or something. I was like, no, it's not. Like there's joy. There's joy in this book.
There's immense amounts of joy.
There's love in this book. But who am I to complain? It's fine.
Well, they always say don't blame the writer for the headline, because
I know, as a journalist, I know they always slap the dumbest stuff on there, and it's, right. It's so embarrassing. I know, I won't. But yeah, I mean, I think it was it was fun to be able to be with a child who was the age of the character I was writing about. It did get very tricky because I wasn't controlling in my initial drafting. I wasn't really controlling where the book was going very well. I was just sort of feeling it through. I allowed it took me about between 5 and 6 years to complete this novel. And so over the course of those years, obviously my own child that I was sort of using as reference to tell me what children at that age are doing and thinking and how they're revealing their thoughts and opinions. I sort of allowed that the child in the book to to age, as my own child was aging in real life. And then that became very tricky in revision to have to sort of beat her back into a two-year-old.
Yeah. So she was. Oh, I don't. Your child was 2-ish when you wrote the first draft. Is that right?
Yeah. I think she was or about to turn 2. Okay. So when. Okay. Yeah, at a certain point, I had to decide, okay, like this is where I'm locking this character in. But as you know, if you're a parent, it becomes very hard to remember what a child does and says when they're 2 years and 3 months versus what they do when they're 3 years. So it was, that was a little bit of a struggle.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting having to go back and remember all that stuff. I mean, I know it's hard. I mean, but one of the things that I loved, and I did warn you before we went on that I was going to gush a little bit. So my apologies. And there's no question at the end of this, but I just wanted, it was something that I read it and I underlined it with yes. You sort of, I feel in a funny sort of way, you sort of captured one of the mysteries of parenthood in 3 words, where I think Tuck is downstairs with Paul and they hear Agnes cry, and Tuck is sort of feeling the urge to go up to see Agnes and to feel the rush of okayness, which was just such a wonderful encapsulation of so much of sort of what parenting is. It's not necessarily ecstasies or agonies. It's just that comfort of just being close to somebody who you adore so much, and I love that, so that rush of okayness. So, and the next obvious question, I suppose, is about Agnes. I mean, I loved her. She's fearless and she's big hearted, but she is also a toddler, and she screams a lot and can be very toddler like. And I suspect one of the reasons why I loved her so much because she wasn't mine. But so she's quite a handful. So how did you, I mean, and again, the last thing I want to do is to ask any personal details, but when you were creating her, you sort of mentioned your daughter, but did you pull from, was it just that experience with your daughter, or how did you go about constructing this wonderful child?
I don't know. I mean, I think that she just sort of, came alive on the page. I decided at a certain point that she was going to be challenging to the narrator because she was so different from her, right? I think, Tuck, our narrator, is very sort of interior, and I think has lived her life as a pretty passive person without too many consequences to that. That was just fine for her until she ended up in this situation that she's in now. And I just wanted, I guess I thought it would just create some good tension if the child was constantly pulling her outside of her comfort zone. I mean, this is sort of a passive, I think, a character who would prefer to sort of stay within her comfort zones, and her child is sort of constantly prodding her outside of it. An example is a scene where they're together on the dock. They're quite hungry. They've been quite hungry for some time, and Agnes has sort of learned, she's just always on the lookout for things that they can eat. And Tuck pulls up they spot a starfish, and which is a scene that I like very much, but Tuck is scared to pick it up. She doesn't know, like, she's never held a starfish before. What is that going to feel like? Can it bite me? but her, her daughter's just screaming at her to do it. And Tuck just she reaches in there and she does it and holds it sort of as long as she can handle it. And then owes Agnes an apology once she's tossed it back out.
Right. Yes, because Agnes didn't like it when it went. There's a great line quite early on when you talk about reading Rumpelstiltskin, and Tuck describes how Agnes listens to the book, and she says it was like a snake digesting a rat, and I can see the story moving through. I just can't see what she's doing with it, which again was just one of those perfect lines of that's, my youngest is 17 now, and I still feel that way about like, what's going on in there. And it was so perfectly the way that you sort of encapsulated that. So
and I don't know if you've experienced this, but it's amazing how so that line went in quite late, maybe the final
interesting
just going through, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, I just feel like I have to add that line. And I don't know what compelled me to add it, but then once it was there, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is what we're watching Tuck do as well, with sort of all of these observations and little, tidbits she's pulling from, the natural world, and from field guides and from the internet, just sort of grabbing at everything she can get. And I realized like, oh, we as the reader are just watching all these things, or feeling all these things move through her in that same way. I just love how you learn about your own book while you're writing it. It just teaches you its own logic as you get to it.
Yeah, and it was just, it was a beautiful encapsulation of how little we actually know our kids. But yes, but that's right. That's lovely. That idea that's what we see her do too. So, well, and I just want to say to everybody watching, if you've got any questions, there is one question already. Great. So we'll get to questions. So you can put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will get Hannah. I've seen your question, and we will we'll get to that in a little while. So still on the question of family, we sort of talked about Agnes, and I also wanted to ask you about Paul as well. So Paul is it's hard for us to see him in a way, for the readers to see him, and perhaps that's because it's a little hard for Tuck too in a way. He's struggling with an addiction to an opioid substitute, and the sort of the narrative, that strain of the narrative reminded me. I don't know if you've read. It's a memoir called "The Rules Do Not Apply" by Ariel Levy. Have you read that? It's a really interesting book, and it's about addiction, and it's about her spouse's alcohol addiction. And one of the things that I took away from it was how one of the most devastating things about when your spouse is doing something like this isn't so much apart from the self-destructive element, is the deception and the lies. And I felt reading this that it was the deception that actually hurt Tuck more in a way, and the fact that all of this money that they didn't have was being spent, and it was the loss of trust that she felt in Paul that really felt like the thing that was bringing everything down. I wonder if you could just talk a bit about trust and how important trust was to Tuck in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Tuck, and I think, we see this in their backstory a bit. I think that Tuck had really come to sort of rely on Paul. I think he was her caregiver, just naturally. I think that's the sort of person he was. And she took to that, that was how he showed her love in their relationship, by taking care of her. And then, that stopped, and she didn't understand why. And then instead of the care, she was, being fed all of these lies. And, it obviously, it took her sort of a while to be willing to see that. But, I think fundamentally, this is the story of a woman who went from sort of pleasantly relying on somebody else to make sure they're okay, to then suddenly being, thrust into the position of having to take care of herself, and to become confident in what she chooses to believe. I think that, it took her a long time to realize that she couldn't believe her husband. And I think, she was slow to let that go. But then, in that absence, there's that sort of question of like, well, then what? Well, then what do I believe? I don't know. So I think she struggles a lot with not willing to believe something that's incorrect. And there are a lot of themes of faith running through the novel, but I think, in the end, she just has to be okay with believing something that might be incorrect, just for the sake of believing something and moving forward.
Oh, that's so interesting. I one of the things that I thought you did so well, you capture the, infinite sort of complexities and contradictory relationships that most married couples have, I think, but you do it through the prism of just one person, which is what was so interesting. And there's a line which I didn't sort of captured it quite well, which was, I worry that my forgiveness can only exist as long as he refuses it, which nicely captured the sort of tension that exists, with all relationships, of course, on some level, but it was just particularly compelling just in the context of that relationship. And because, as I said, Paul, I mean, we sort of hear him on the other side of the bedroom door when he's going through withdrawal and all of these things, but he's not there. His absence is very largely what in some ways defines him, and so we only get this one perspective, but you do such a good job of still conveying all of that complexity and the emotions that are there. I don't think I had a question at the end of that. I just wanted to say how brilliant it is. So, and one of the other things that I really liked about how you portrayed all of this was you do a wonderful job of capturing the fury that Agnes, that Tuck has, but you do it by, I felt, really dialing it back. And she either doesn't say anything or she just keeps it in her mind, or it's very, and I was just curious as to whether it came out like that in the first draft, or whether that was something that required a degree of sort of rewriting and re-editing to so that you pitched it where you wanted it to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I love the use of restraint in writing. I feel like there's so much more power in what lives just outside of what is written. So, I very much wanted the reader to feel that fury, but I didn't want them to have a chance to dismiss it or feel like they fully understood it. I just wanted to be sort of a tension. I did try to avoid writing any confrontation scenes at all. And my editor, I think, wisely insisted that I write at least one scene where they're actually talking about things head to head. So that was probably the hardest scene to write. Writing a fight, it's so easy to do it so poorly, emotions are so sloppy, and I was really scared of messing that up. So I really fretted over that, and pretty much as I was doing it, I'd write, and then as a general rule, just try to delete at least half of it, just take out, just like just slash half the sentences, put it aside for a couple of weeks, come back to it. Does this make me cringe? Like, do I feel anything here? If I do, how can I tweak that? So Yeah, that was tricky.
Yeah. So did that scene then, that was quite near the end, that went in on at a later.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like the final pass, but I think it was, you know, I'd been working on the book for a couple of years before we, you know, even put it out. And then I think it was probably my first revision with my editor,
Okay.
Kendall, a wonderful editor, and, you know, was able to see things very clearly and could see what I was trying to.
Okay. I did have a question about your editor, and just, you know, it seems to me there are two kinds of editors in these days, and there are ones who just acquire and publish, and there are ones who actually really work with authors and work on the text. I think you answered the question. He clearly did that with you, and really sort of rolled up his sleeves and helped you. Is that right?
Yeah, she did, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing to me to think how much support and faith and love goes into helping a writer create their first novel. I mean, I got so lucky. I have the most amazing agent, Sarah Bolin, who had been working as an editor for a decade before she decided to become an agent. And I connected with her right as she was had made that switch, that career switch, and was still, you know, building up that client base. So she had the time and, you know, to spend with me then, sort of helping me get the book ready. So she and Kendall, who then became my editor a couple of years later, you know, who took on the book that I at the time thought was like great and ready to go. Like, let's just run this. Let's go for it. You know, looking back now, I see what an absolute mess of pages she received and was sort of willing to make a leap of faith on. So yeah, definitely a lot of help from really wonderful, smart women who, you know, just make it happen for.
Well, and the Catapult's such a wonderful imprint. I mean, I'll read anything they send me, and so it was so good, and I can imagine that it would take, you know, because this book is, I mean, as I think people will have realized, I'm a fan, but, you know, I can imagine that it wouldn't be. Some editors would go, well, I can see all of this, but it's, you know, it's so different in some ways that it would require a certain kind of editor. And so, you know, you always pray for that perfect fit. And, you know, I've heard stories of people who haven't had that. So, you know, wonderful job. And it's you know, it's interesting. And I love talking to people about the editing process and how much was changed. So that's fascinating. So I know we've got some questions, and I'm conscious of time, and as usual, I'm already getting way behind on all the things I wanted to ask you, but I did want to talk about Maine for a little bit. You know, there's something about Maine, I don't know what it is, that people can't seem to stop writing about it. I mean, just this, there's the guest book by Sarah Blake, and then I'm just reading at the moment Fellowship Point by Alice Elliott Dark, both of which are set on grand sort of you know, rather posh and grand sort of estates on islands in Maine. And Kerry Osno was recently in the shop, and she wrote Milltown, which is a nonfiction book, a memoir about her growing up in rural Maine. And I know that you live in Portland now, but I was curious, sort of given the timeline of all of this, had you started writing this before you moved to Maine, or were you in Maine and then you began writing it?
Yeah, I've lived here for about 12 years now, and I started writing this about 6 years ago. So
okay.
Yeah, and I think you know, yes, people are drawn to writing about Maine, yourself included.
Yes, well,
I'm curious about your connection, but yes, I've been reading. Is it Setting Free the Kites? Is that?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yes, and I was surprised. I was like, oh, this is here. this is.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things. I sort of, you know, I mean, my wife and I love going to Maine, and you know, I thought, well, this is great. I can write a book there, and then everything's suddenly tax deductible. So let's do it. But no, I mean, I love writing about it. But what's interesting is that oh, sorry, my dog is busy waking up. I apologize. Is the Maine that Alice Elliott Dark write about, and Sarah Blake, and me to a degree, because that's also touristy, is very, very different to the Maine that we see in this book. And I mean, Maine is a bit like Missouri in that it's a state of contradictions. I think people think of Maine and they think of Kennebunkport and Portland and all the wonderful restaurants, but there is this incredible poverty. You don't have to go very far inland to discover these towns that have been sort of decimated by pollution and by poverty and the failure of the paper mills and all of those sorts of things. And there's a real sort of hard scrabble element to that. And one of the things about this book, and again, is apparent, is the sense of hunger that just every page seems to, so is pervaded by it. And we see Tuck sort of literally counting pennies and working out, well, how much can I afford to do, and having to make these impossible choices between, do I fill up the car with $2 of gas, or do I buy this thing to feed my child? And I was curious, when you began, did you always know that was the Maine that you were going to show us?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, so this book wasn't always called Lungfish. Its working title was Islanders, which, we decided against just because there are so many books with very similar titles and how would it stand out. But I bring that up because to me, it was very much like the other Islanders. I think, not what you would expect, sort of picking up a Maine book with, bare feet walking across a beach with, the ocean in the background. So yeah, I mean, I think I did want to, give a glimpse at, what's going on. I mean, island life is so disparately experienced. I mean, there's so much money on some of the islands that coexist literally right next to, such poverty. And, there are, certainly drug problems, drug crises on islands. There, is depression and isolation as much as there is, sort of community and like solid, salt of the earthiness. So yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned the title, and can you explain to us what a lungfish is and why you chose it as the title?
Yeah, I mean, so it's just a little metaphor that pops up about halfway through the book. Tuck remembers having learned at one point about this fish that lives in, she doesn't bring all this into it, but I'll tell you, they're found in both Australia and Africa. They are river fish. They have the capability of surviving droughts by sort of cocooning themselves in the mud, when the river that they're living in completely dries out, and they'll sort of make a mucusy cocoon for themselves within that mud. And they can survive like that for years. I think, what Tuck has heard is 3.5 years. So that's the figure that's in the book. But yeah, they have that ability to survive a drought, which is, I won't explain to you why that relates, but they're also interesting creatures just separately. I think, scientists, biologists now are thinking that they're the first creatures to actually walk. They have these fins that they use to ambulate along the substrate. And so there's all these great old sort of engravings, capturing them sort of walking out of the water, because they do have lungs. They need to breathe oxygen. Actually, they're so they're the yes. So I don't want to explain the little metaphor there. It's not like a complicated one. It's pretty on the nose, but it's just a little blip. And I like a lungfish is it's not a creature that belongs in that place either. Most of the sort of reflections on the natural world are of the place. The lungfish moment is a little different in that, Tuck is bringing in this creature from another continent. And, she's not really a Mainer herself. She's an Indiana girl who has landed there. So.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I loved all of the writing about the island that you did. One of the things, which again, just going back to the main trope, was that, I kept having to sort of look up in the dictionary some of the terms that you used, and you mentioned some of them came up in that little reading that you gave, but there were times I thought, what is that? And it was almost like this alien landscape. You could have been on the moon. And the way, and that's probably just speaks to my ignorance of these things, but I loved it, and the way that all the various things that that Tuck finds to eat, and I was just curious as to how much. I mean, did you sort of go to an island and do some research and work out, well, what is that, or how did you do to find all that wonderful stuff out?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a very intimate relationship with a property that shares a lot in common with the place, the setting of this book. But it had never taken on that sort of survival element. So it was fun to begin to look at the landscape in a new way and think, how would you survive in this place? I mean, I had often wondered, like, how would you survive in this place in the winter? And over my whole life, I've always been trying to convince my dad, like, oh, like we could winter. I want to live out here in the winter, even if it means having no access to shore. And, we'll live in one room with the wood stove going. And he's sort of constantly telling me, like, no, you'll die. No, you'll die. No, you'll die. So I think I've always lived with that sort of notion of like, oh, like there's always this natural expiration date, and it becomes dangerous, which is sort of this, that's the fascinating thing about Maine. I mean, it gives and it takes, and it sort of puts you through the ringer, and you have to earn all of the beautiful moments that it gives you, because the flip side of that is basically constant darkness for the other 6 months. But yeah, so it was fun to look at that landscape and to do research and start looking at field guides and learning what could be eaten. Also responding to my daughter's own like natural desire to try things. She was constantly just shoving seaweed in her mouth and saying like, is this okay? And I was sort of like, I hope so. I think so. Yeah. So then I'd, go do some research. And
the episode with the white baneberries, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but where Agnes eats these berries and has to be rushed to the hospital. I mean, I just, again, as a parent, it was just awful to read, and done so well, because it was like, it is everyone's sort of worst nightmare. So so brilliantly done. So I'm just having a look at these questions. So Bradley has asked a question. Well, I'll read it to you. I mean, I think we probably discussed this, but so the New York Times piece mentioned the symbolism of lungfish as epic survivalists, but how did you initially arrive at that title? Well, I think you sort of addressed that. And then lungfish aren't endemic to the North Atlantic, but are fascinating creatures from Africa, Australia, etc. They certainly have made for an intriguing title and cover art. Oh, that's it. So is the so this is, for those of you who haven't seen the book yet, this is I'm just having to move some things around. Oh, you can't see it because of this stupid thing. Do you have a copy?
So elusive. Yes.
Good. Could you hold yours up, because it's clearly not working for me? So is that what it is? What is the cover? I hadn't thought of asking that. Such an interesting. Is that a lungfish or some?
It is. Yeah, it's a lungfish with a bit of kelp there.
Okay.
Yeah, I love it. It's Nicole Caputo did the design, and she's just brilliant.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. Love it. All right, and then Hannah has a question. Hi, Meghan. I'm wondering if there was a driving theme that started off your process, or if you started with Tuck and built the story from there.
Yeah, it began with Tuck, but more specifically, it began with the disorientation that Tuck was experiencing, and then sort of experimenting with how to get that disorientation onto the page. And then Tuck grew out from that.
So I had a couple more questions. So one of the things that I loved about this book were the bumper stickers, which, and this was kind of like, just to explain very briefly, I'll try not sort of murder it. So, well, perhaps I should ask you to explain the bumper stickers and the part that they play in the book.
Yeah. So, I mean, so Tuck very much like is at the mercy of what has been left to her, or not even left to her, but left for her to discover. And she's sort of, desperately trying to make use of those things. And sometimes that is a little bit absurd, as is the case with these old bumper sticker kits that her father had invented, back when Tuck herself was a teenager. This was sort of his big idea to like become a capitalist and join society, because his wife wasn't really happy with their poverty at that point. So yeah, it's just a relic from the past, that has been left in the house. And so she's trying to make use of these kits, just the way she's trying to make use of everything else, and just sort of leverage everything into like cash mostly. But they're also, Tuck doesn't have a lot of, she doesn't really have any adults to talk to. She's basically alone with a toddler for the entire novel. So she begins using the bumper sticker kits as just sort of a way to sort of maybe release more adult thoughts, things that she's not going to necessarily say to a 2-year-old. So it's quite absurd, but life is quite absurd. And it's worth mentioning that my real father, who bears little resemblance to the father in this book, but he actually did invent the make your own bumper sticker kit when I was a teenager. And I think he had like some quite a bit, you'd be shocked, quite a bit of stock remaining after he sort of gave up on the whole enterprise. And I think that I sold them at Get Lost.
Did you?
I sort of remember today, because talking to you, I was sort of thinking about Get Lost more, and I was like, wait a minute, I think I sold those there. So it's possible there are a few rolling around Columbia, Missouri. You'll have to keep your eyes open. They were really horrid colors. And
I will do. That's so funny. I mean, when I see a detail like that, which is so perfect, I think that had to come from somewhere. It's like, and so yeah, that's and I loved it because, so Tuck produces these lovely sentiments and these sort of quite poetic little aphorisms, and it's funny because it's become such a cliche. Well, you could put that on a bumper sticker, and then here's Tuck actually taking this or you taking it and turning that around and giving it some real meaning, which I just thought was wonderful. Okay, we are very close to the end, so I'm just going to ask you 2 more questions. First of all, so this is your first novel. It's out now. What are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, not a lot. I'm sort of, I'll be honest, like I've been very jittery. I don't know if you experienced that with your first. I find I'm like, I can't really read anything. And I also am having a hard time writing anything. I do have a collection of short stories going that, they do speak to one another. So that could become a thing. They're set like in my neighborhood during early pandemic days, and it could become something, but I'm not totally convinced yet. I've got to keep scratching away there.
Did you have trouble writing during the pandemic? Because a lot of people I know just couldn't. Everyone would say to them, "Oh, this must be so nice for you because you can just sit down and write all day." But a lot of people were just frozen. They couldn't do anything. What did you? I mean, I certainly, that happened to me.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was really lucky in that this book was already seriously underway.
Perfect.
So it was a great escape. And it was so funny. I mean, this book, I thought, I began writing it before the pandemic, and I sort of thought, I was like, oh, it's this very grim book. Nobody's going to want to read it. It's such a bummer of a book. And then like we lived through the pandemic, and now I see it so differently. I think maybe our threshold has changed or something, but I see it as much more sort of joyful now.
I found tons of joy in it, I must say, and it's interesting. Okay, final question, because we are just edging up to the hour mark. You used to be a bookseller. I'm a bookseller, so I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you what you have read and loved lately that we can all run out and buy and read.
Yeah, that people can buy from Skylark on your website, for example. Yeah. I mean, I always, despite all that experience, always panic and draw a blank and can't remember a single book that I've ever read. But very helpfully, you have one on display behind you in the top left corner. You can see some hot pink, and that is part of the bottom half of Farah Ali's short story collection, People Want to Live, which is a very beautiful book, a collection of stories about quiet people in transition. I think is probably the best way I could put that. But those are so lovely, and such muscular sentences in that book that almost go either their muscle almost goes under the radar. It's so finely wrought. Want by Lynn Steger Strong is a wonderful book that came out. I think it came out 2021. I was a little late in getting to that, but a great exploration of female want, sort of the way that it sort of sneaks in and grows and is given space, but then like also comes with costs. So I would recommend that to just about anybody. Time as a Mother by Ocean Vuong. I love reading poetry sometimes, especially when, deeply engaged in the writing process. It can be hard to read fiction because other voices creep in, or, you just have these like crises of confidence reading other people's books. You just like, oh, they're better. Like I should just give up. So yeah, I do turn to poetry.
Yeah. Well, those are all wonderful, and we're big fans of Ocean at Skylark, and we sell a ton of his books because they're very, very. Have you read his? Did you read the novel
On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous? Yeah. Such a beautiful book.
Just amazing. Good. Well, this was. I mean, you talk about beautiful books. Lungfish is a beautiful book. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing all of your thoughts and your answers. It's been a real joy, and we do have copies, of course, at Skylark, and we would be thrilled to sell you one. If you like to, you can either give us a call at 573-777-6990, drop us a line at mail@skylarkbookshop.com, or you can go onto our website and order it there. And just before we go, I will remind everybody watching that tomorrow night at 6:30, we have Sarah Kendzior, who will be in store to talk about her astonishing new book, They Knew. So it's been a busy time this week, but this has been such a joy. Thank you so much, Meghan. Really enjoyed speaking with you, and hope you'll come back to the corner.
I will definitely pop in next time I'm here.
to Ninth Station. Welcome. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for watching.
Everybody.
Have a good night.
You as well.
Bye-bye.